unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. On April 2nd, the U.S. government announced a host of sweeping tariff hikes with every single one of America's trading partners. The aim of the so-called Liberation Day tariffs was ostensibly to rebalance the global trading system, as some Trump advisors have put it. However, the drastic measures roiled markets and eventually resulted in the president imposing a 90-day pause on most tariffs, with the exception of strategic sectors and imports from China. India, for its part, was slapped with a 26% tariff, even as top officials were negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with their American counterparts. While the fate of future tariffs and any side agreements are unknown, the episode raises serious questions about India's global economic strategy. To talk about where India goes from here, I'm joined on the show this week by Shoumitro Chatterjee. Shoumitro is an assistant professor of international economics at Johns Hopkins-SAIS. His research lies at the intersection of development economics, trade, and macro. He's also done seminal work on the role of agriculture in development. To discuss trade, tariffs, and a lot more, I'm pleased to welcome Shoumitro back to the show. Shoumitro, good to see you.
Thanks, Milan. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So I want to start by going back in time to a paper that you and Arvind Subramaniam, the former chief economic advisor to the government of India, wrote about India's sort of trade and macro policy. And in that paper, which we will link to in the show notes, you and Arvind write that contrary to popular perception, India has been an exemplar of the export-led growth model. Now, I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast might be surprised by the statement because many, if not most of us, have a mental image of India as being relatively inward-looking, somewhat protectionist. Obviously, there's a long legacy of kind of autarky and skepticism about kind of, globalization and so on. What did the conventional wisdom miss?
So thanks for that. It's a great question to start with. There are a couple of ways to think about it. So let me just throw some stats out there to get us started. One way to see how kind of India is an exceptional trader is to look at a very standard measure of openness, which is the trade to GDP ratio, which is basically exports plus imports divided by the GDP. India's trade to GDP ratio is around 38-39%, right at the top with China's, which we know is like a mega exporter in the world and a source of what is going on in the world right now. Even according to the gravity model of trade, which is often used by economists to predict the size of trade given a country's geographic position, i.e. do you have ports, how far you are from trade partners and so on, and your economic size, even as per that model, India trades more than it should statistically. So in that sense, India is quite open and trades with the world. The other way to look at why we call like India an exemplar of the trade model is that between 1995 and 2015, so that kind of 20-year period, which is post kind of liberalization, and we can get into the details about the across-the-board tariff reduction. India's growth rate of exports, not only goods plus services, but growth rate of exports of goods and especially manufactured goods was some of the highest in the world. Depending on where you pull data from, India ranked third or fourth in the world in terms of growth rate of exports. Our growth rate of exports was twice the world average. And this exceptional growth in trade and exports brought a lot of prosperity to India. It brought economic growth, it reduced poverty, and so on. Right. So where does this all conflict with our other understanding? The reason why it gets confusing is that India has a lot of missed potential. So when we say India is open, looking at either the gravity model or the trade to GDP ratio, what we miss is the denominator, that our GDP is small because we are not trading to our potential. And because our GDP is small, our trade to GDP ratio can be quite high, right? And that's kind of the paradox. And I think in the new book that Arvind and Devesh Kapoor are writing, they have a chapter kind of delving into details about this.
So just focusing on this for one more second, Shoumitro, the story that you and Arvind told in that paper is not unambiguously positive, because in the same breath, you also note that, India's aggregate performance, which, when it comes to kind of exports was pretty good, it's also coexisted with an underperformance in unskilled manufacturing exports, right? Now, given how buoyant high-skilled manufacturing exports have been, not to mention services exports, what are the larger implications for this underperformance, as you call it, when it comes to low-skilled or unskilled manufacturing?
I think the biggest one is jobs, right? I think we forget that in the last kind of 5-6 years or so, one big issue that has plagued the Indian economy, along with the debates about GDP and stuff, is that we are not creating enough jobs. And so we might be doing very well in terms of increasing both production and exports of high-skill manufactured goods or services. The truth remains that both because they absorb less labor and because they are a small share of the overall labor force, the impact on the net jobs that you create is always going to be less. And so from an employment perspective, from producing more jobs and stuff, we have to somehow kickstart our low-skill, labor-intensive manufacturing sector. There is no other sector that is going to create that many. You might be able to create a little bit, but not at a scale that is required to absorb the big labor endowment, especially the young big labor endowment that India is sitting on.
So does this kind of explain the earlier puzzle, right? We tend not to think of India as an example of the export-led model of growth because the examples that we conjure up tend to be the kind of East Asian tigers, which did very well when it came to low-end manufacturing, right? When we think of China, when we think of Vietnam, we think of, they're creating factories for the world. India clearly missed that.
I think that's exactly right. Even if you go to the South Korean history, in the initial part of its export journey, a lot of it came from low skill sectors rather than electronics and so on.
So I want to kind of take us to another paper that you and Arvind did. This one was published in 2023. And this was trying to characterize and describe a new inward turn that India had taken. And part of what you say is, look, you had this period from liberalization, 1991, to about 2014, when average MFN, most favored nation tariffs in India declined from 125% to 13%, right? So a sea change in that, say, quarter century or so. But this started to reverse in 2014, and we saw a particularly sharp uptick in tariff barriers in 2017, 2018, and after. Tell us a little bit about, what drove these increases, right? Why did India see this inward turn? And what has changed between 2018, when we first saw those tariff increases, to, 2025, where we are today?
I think our best guess why that. So just to give the listener some context, between 2017 and 2018, tariffs were increased in almost 2,500 product categories, HS 6-digit categories. That's a big number, like in terms of the scope of products that are being covered. And average MFN rates between those 2 years went up from something like, as you said, 13% to about 17.5 or 17.6%. So that was about like a 4.5 percentage jump over the course of a year. Why did it happen? Our best guess is that there had been discussions of self-reliance going on, and there was kind of a need felt to protect our domestic production sectors and divert domestic demand towards domestic companies. And I think it's that economic thought that led to that reversal. What has changed between then and now? The tariffs have changed a little bit. I mean, in the sense that they tried to reduce it a little bit, but the impact hasn't been much. In fact, if I looked at the most recent USTR report on India, the average tariffs are about 17%. So it has basically gone down by only half a percentage point. But the big thing that has come in its place are these quality control orders. So before basically around 2014, before 2018, the quality control orders, which are these standards that both domestic producers and foreign importers into India should adhere to, existed for about 10 sectors at the most. But more recently, so by 2024, the quality control orders have shot up exponentially. So now they cover 100 sectors and about 800 products. Now they are applied, as I said, they are applied to both domestic products and foreign products. And then the question arises, why does this become like a trade barrier, or what we like to call as trade economists non-tariff barriers? The reason is that if a foreign supplier into India has to get approval from, let's say, the Bureau of Standards, then Indian officials have to travel to these foreign facilities to examine the standards and then give them a certificate. In practice, all this is fine if it's just done from the point of view of maintaining standards. But what happens is that there are huge delays in certifying these products, and that kind of kills imports into the country, and effectively a quality standard starts behaving as a non-tariff barrier. So one sector that has been quite significantly impacted by this is our apparel sector, which again is key for our low-skill manufacturing story. So around 2022, I think they had reduced the tariffs for viscose and polyester, which are the two key man-made fibers, which are like critical for production of apparel. So think about Nike products and Uniqlo and all that stuff. And in the data, you see that as soon as the tariffs were reduced, there is a huge surge of imports of raw materials, the viscose and polyester, and then the QCOs come in, and then everything just crashes. I think that would sum up our kind of journey between that period and today.
So, I mean, just so I, understand what you're saying, the Indian government wants to certify quality control on, imports are coming in, but also, as you said, domestic manufacturing as well. And in principle, there's nothing wrong with this, right? You want to make sure that the stuff you're bringing into the country meets, whether it's sanitary or any other standards. But in practice, it seems your point is that this has led to inordinate delays that are akin to essentially, a kind of another form of protectionism, as it were.
Yes, you're exactly right. So let me clarify a little bit more. So if I look at cross-country, like if I look at non-tariff barriers that India imposes vis-a-vis what other countries impose, Europe has far more quality standards than India does, right? It's very hard to make these comparisons for a variety of reasons. But if I just go by plain vanilla number of products covered or the number of orders issued, India is not at the top of the pack, probably in the middle or thereabouts, right? But what matters is implementation. If it's just standards, then you could do other things. For example, you could say if a product has met European standards, we don't need to recertify it. We would accept those standards, right? Maybe you want to have exceptions for agriculture because your agricultural standards are different from theirs. But as you said, it's the delays, it's the opaqueness of implementation, it's the uncertainty that surrounds the whole thing that morphs this into essentially a non-tariff barrier. Frankly, when they first came about, like my initial understanding was that maybe they are standards, but maybe they are also a way to protect India from cheap Chinese imports, which we all know has had a devastating impact on the manufacturing sectors of not only the US but most of the Western world. But this is being applied everywhere. So most recently, Indonesia filed a case in the WTO against India, basically saying that India is not certifying their exports of the man-made fibers that they send to India.
Wow. Well, I want to come back to this because when we talk about the future, I know you have thoughts on kind of, tariff as well as non-tariff barriers, but let me just kind of get to the heart of the issue, which is the kind of, Trump's, tariff tantrum. But kind of before we talk about the U.S. moves, I'd like to ask you to do kind of one thing to kind of help put things in comparative perspective, right? So before the events of last week, how did average import tariffs in India compare to, say, average import tariffs in the United States, right? I guess if I were to say this a different way, when Trump calls India the so-called quote unquote tariff king, is there a strong case for him to make?
I think India is guilty as charged. There is no getting away from that. Amongst like the big countries of the world, India probably has. And now we make this statement carefully because you don't know where the U.S. tariffs are. But amongst the big countries of the world, India probably has the highest tariff. So overall, and I'm talking about just before the reciprocal tariffs were announced. The Indian average MFN tariff was about, I think, 17%. The US and EU were about 4%. China was about 7%. If I look at industrial tariffs, India was about 13%, and US and EU would be about 3.5 or 4%, and China would be about 6-7% again. What kind of hides in these averages are two things. One is that even though the Indian average tariff might look like 13%, there are specific categories where the tariffs are very high. So, for example, motorcycles and cars, where they try to prevent the imports of luxury vehicles, they would try to put 75% and so on. So if I go by the number of tariff lines that have more than 50% average tariff rate, then India is again probably one of the leading countries in the world doing that. The other piece comes from what we call bound tariffs. Now, MFN tariffs are the actual applied tariffs, and the bound tariffs that countries declare to WTO are kind of tying your own hand and saying, in no state of the world are we going to increase our tariffs above the bound rates. And Indian bound tariffs are also very high, which means that our trade partners are always kind of uncertain about when are we going to increase tariffs. And if we do, the scope for us to do because of the bound rates that we have declared is quite high. The other category where India has, I guess, again, the largest tariffs is agriculture. So the average applied tariffs in agriculture is about 40%. So this includes 30% plus all these cesses that are hidden, as compared to, again, 7 or 8% in US and the EU and about 12% in China. The last piece to note about our tariff schedule and tariff regime is the whole complexity. So it's one thing to say we have 17% tariff, but it's 17% across the board. But what we actually have is about 60 to 65 unique tariff lines, meaning 60 to 65 different tariff rates, with a lot of exceptions. And this leads to a lot of uncertainty and enforcement problems. So you would have heard there was this recent kind of case against Volkswagen, who were asked to pay $1.4 billion for tariff evasion from 10 years ago because they imported parts in a single shipment rather than, they imported parts in different shipments rather than in a single shipment, which would have attracted a different tariff. And all this complexity just leads to confusion, both from an enforcement point of view, but also from the point of view of trade partners and reducing trade overall.
But, just to pause for a second, I mean, if you read the Washington Post or any U.S. newspaper, you would be familiar with the fact that the United States lavishes quite exorbitant subsidies on its agricultural sector. In Europe, if you were to read the Financial Times, you would hear about the strength of the ag lobby and the fact that, Europeans have a very protectionist attitude when it comes to, whether it's dairy or other crops and so on and so forth. So protectionism clearly isn't an India specific thing, but when you look at, what the average tariff is, you still see, despite all of that coddling of special interests, if you want to call them that, in the U.S. and the EU, other places, Japan, the average interest still remains much, much, much lower there than it does in India.
I think in what you said, there are 2 or 3 points, and we can take them one by one. So yes, it is true that protectionism is everywhere. Since you picked up on agriculture, we should have like a more detailed discussion about agriculture.
We'll come back to that. Yeah,
because that's slightly more nuanced. There can be 2 or 3 different forms of subsidizing exports, right? One is you want to distort terms of trade, which you would do through tariffs, or you could do things like providing subsidies to manufacturers, which India is also doing in the form of production-linked incentives or PLIs. In general, providing subsidies would be less distortionary than trying to play with the terms of trade, which has all sorts of other misallocation type consequences.
Yeah, but on a global scale, clearly, right? Because you're trying to trade with other countries. Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
So we'll come back to agriculture because, as I mentioned at the top, you've done a lot of work in agriculture, and that fits into the trade debate. But let's just footnote it for now. Let's come now to the dramatic announcements of last week, the so-called Liberation Day tariffs. You had a piece in the Indian Express, which I would commend really to all of our listeners as really a model for kind of clear and lucid writing on a very complicated issue. And basically what you said was these tariffs imposed on India and basically every other country of the world, as people have been joking, including territories exclusively inhabited by penguins, they constituted what you called a seismic shock to the global trade order. Before we get into what this means for India, the subsequent pause on tariffs and so on, just give us a sense of like the overall size and scale of how big these Liberation Day tariffs actually were.
So thanks for your appreciation about the op-ed. I think the reason I called it a seismic shock is maybe threefold. One is that it's a complete reversal from the way of doing trade as we know it. So one of the foundational pieces of the whole GATT and WTO system was the principle of non-discrimination, meaning outside of preferential agreements where you would give preferential tariffs, i.e. lower tariffs to certain trade partners, you would not discriminate against any other trade partner. And by announcing differential tariffs for different countries, that principle has been broken. The second reason why this was a seismic shock is because it has been done by everybody's largest or second largest trade partner, which is the US. Remember, US in the post kind of World War age is the provider of many global public goods. And one big global public good is it sets the rules of the game. And central to the rules of the game of the global trading system was everybody adhered to this principle of non-discrimination. And the reason why everybody did it is because the US did it. And once the US retreats from that principle from non-discrimination, it will become very hard. It might still be the case that everybody else kind of gathers around and say we will stick to those principles. But if the largest trade partner of everybody is not doing it, then making that case becomes harder. And the last piece is just the size of the shock, right? So there are these infamous Smoot-Hawley tariffs from the Great Depression era, where the average tariff rate was about 20% or so. These tariffs were of an order of magnitude higher than that, even if I weight everything by the trade volumes. Combine that with the fact that when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs happened, the world was not as integrated. The system of global value chains hadn't taken place. So you were not trying to build a bicycle where one component was located in one country and so on and so forth. You hit the world with that type of a shock in a world that is already more deeply integrated. The effects, for lack of a better word, has to be cataclysmic.
I mean, it's remarkable, right? Like Smoot-Hawley, like for anyone who's taken a economic history class or any history class, is like, kind of a textbook example of like what you don't want to do if you want to avoid like global meltdown. And here we've seen something that's kind of orders of magnitude greater. I mean, I should point out, I'm sure most of our listeners know that, after equity markets suffered a bloodbath, the bond markets went haywire in the United States. Trump eventually pulled back. He paused the application of these draconian tariffs for 90 days. Instead, he levied this kind of across the board 10% minimum tariff. He did single out China, however, for I think what are now, it keeps changing every day, I think 145% tariffs on imports from China, though he undercut those by later exempting things like smartphones and computers and other tech devices. Now, one thing that markets really hate and seem to abhor is uncertainty, right? It's one thing if you slap high tariffs, but if people can kind of, take that as a given, then they can kind of, triage and build around it. But, constantly changing rules and requirements is very difficult. Do you think that this pause and where we are today has calmed investors' nerves? Do you think that level of uncertainty has gone down? Or is this really only likely to kind of make things worse? Because, it seems like every other day we're getting a tweet or a message or an announcement that, things have changed.
Honestly, I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows what information the big investors have that we don't have. I'm not even sure that what happened in the stock markets or in the bond markets might have been a contributing reason to the pause on the tariffs, or whether it was a well thought out strategy from the first place. So my answer to that question is, I guess we'll have to just wait and watch and then retrospectively answer it. At this stage, it's very difficult to say how the markets are reacting.
Yeah, I mean, I should say we're recording this on Monday, April 14th. Just over the weekend, President Trump kind of said that the media had been misrepresenting the, kind of special exceptions that had been made. It really wasn't as was being reported. No one really knows what that means until we get further clarification. But let's now turn to the thing that we really wanted to discuss, which is kind of what this all means for India. Under the Liberation Day plan, India was slapped with, I think, a 27% tariff. Of course, that's now gone down for 10% for now. When the so-called reciprocal tariffs were announced, you wrote that, this opens up a window of opportunity for India, because even though it had this 26% tariff, those rates were still lower than those imposed on many of its competitors, including many of its low-cost Asian competitors, right? So I guess my question to you is, do you think that that window of opportunity, is it still relevant, and is it still open?
I think so. So let me back up for a moment and be careful about this. I'm not at all trying to say that that this is going to be a glorious period, right? So suppose that the pause goes away and the tariffs are indeed imposed, or even let's say an average tariff of, let's say, 20% is imposed across the board by the US. That's going to shrink the global market like anything, and all the negative consequences for the world that come with it. But there is nothing much we can, as policymakers in India, there is nothing much you can do about it. You kind of have to take that global environment as given. Once I start from there, which is I take the global environment from given and ask what is the best strategy for India to pursue, I think there my arguments are still valid, that the best strategy for us is to have a more open economy, with probably an exception for agriculture, and an economy with a very stable policy regime. See, the core of my argument in that op-ed did not, I made kind of the argument about the relative tariffs and so on, but that's not the key. The key is that, look, India is small in the global market. So I said India's trade to GDP ratio is high and as high as China, but India's share in the global manufacturing sector is only about 2%, as compared to something like 16% that China has. Which means that even in a world where all countries are now getting sensitive to something like bilateral trade deficits, which nobody should be focusing on, if India gains market share steadily and slowly, right, the nominal change in those numbers are not going to be of a magnitude that's going to attract attention, right? And no matter what, China is going to cede some export space just because wages in China are rising, because they are developing and progressing. And as long as we are able to capture that market share, that would mean from our perspective that we are exporting gradually a little bit more. And that would be enough for us to give a healthy growth rate in terms of GDP per capita. And then if we do it in the low-skill, labor-intensive manufacturing sectors, then we would also be creating enough jobs.
So let me go back to what you wrote in the piece, right? And because you kind of have three core parts of your argument, right? You first write that while the U.S. may be using reciprocal tariffs as a pressure tactic to bring countries to the negotiating table, India should liberalize trade policy not reactively, but as part of a long-term strategy, right? So it's like irrespective of whatever the U.S. wants to do, India should do this for its own reasons. And again, you mentioned kind of three things in particular. Maybe we should take each one of them one by one. The first is that you say India must take tariffs and they must lower them and they must rationalize them. What is the kind of ideal tariff structure for India in your view, right? I mean, where would you like to see the government go?
I think overall somewhere between 5 and 10%, right? And if you want a uniform tariff is always better. And the argument is not very different from what we say about income taxes or about the GST, which started as like having one rate and three rates to now having gazillions of rates. You could have, like, let's say, a tariff of 5% on input products, and then about, let's say, 8 or 10% on everything else. On top of that, if you want to kind of promote a certain industry and so on, you could use your PLIs to do that. Some people worry about like cheap imports and so on and so forth, but there are other kind of provisions if the WTO stays, then there are other provisions in like anti-dumping duties and so on that can be used.
Let me just say that it's just scary that you have to caveat it, which is if the WTO stays.
I mean, the reason is because the last round of the negotiations were not ratified. So it was kind of already on a decline, and now with this big event, things might look very different. But you can always use countervailing measures to kind of prevent cheap imports from coming in. There is another advantage of having kind of a uniform tariff, or maybe like two rates. One is you're not trying to pick winners and losers, right? So this is kind of the input-output idea, which is that the playing field is level for everybody, and then whichever industry is more productive, that industry will take advantage and grow. And all industries will have access to the cheapest inputs wherever they want to source it from across the world. There is a recent push towards FTAs, which has its advantages and disadvantages, but I think Noah Smith had a great post this morning. I would rather have a trade policy where you want to exclude some countries rather than try to do bilateral negotiations and include countries. And then, of course, given the geopolitics of the day, we have to create exceptions for agriculture in India.
So, it sounds like, what you're calling for, a uniform tariff structure, maybe a two-tiered system, is to help fix, the kind of analog to what we've seen on the domestic side with, say, GST, where you've come up with such a complicated system, which not only might lend itself to rent seeking, but just also, transaction costs for businesses, right? Because there's this multiple rate structure with all of these exemptions and so on and so forth, creates a lot of complexity, which just makes the ease of doing business a lot less easy.
And on top of that, provide long-term stability, which is critical to get foreign investment, right? So if a foreign company is thinking about investing in India from, let's say, a 10-year perspective, one, stability comes from not changing your policy too often, but the other one comes from simplicity, because if it's simple, then it's hard to go wrong, right? So the Volkswagen case or the Samsung case all came about because the tariff structure was complex. And of course, once the tariff structure is complex, companies are trying to get the best deal for themselves. And then the agencies will look at cases which are 10-year-old, and it just sets a very bad example, pushing away foreign investment rather than trying to attract them.
I mean, this was the kind of second of your recommendations, right? Is that India needs to ensure policy stability because, if India is frequently revising tariffs or they're imposing retrospective duties, that is going to chill investment and trade. Now, that seems to be a little bit of wishful thinking in the sense that, the Indian government has not been following this advice, but also the global trade regime is changing and evolving so rapidly, right? It may be there may be pressures to try and change as others change, right?
So you're exactly right. I think you're exactly right in saying that there may not be enough of a domestic kind of political appetite for this, for the variety of reasons that you mentioned. I should say that, I mean, in response to, just going back to the earlier question you asked, which is that why did India have that reversal in 2017-18 in terms of increasing tariffs? And I forgot to mention it then. The other reason was the world was also getting used to this China shock and kind of reacting to this. So some of the Indian response could also have been mimicking that global response. And you rightly said that could, those kind of pressures could exist even now. But my argument is that in in a world where everybody is creating uncertainty, you could luck out as the winner if you are the only or a large country that provides policy certainty.
I mean, that becomes your distinguishing
exactly.
feature, is that everyone else is fluctuating and you're kind of,
And the more stability you provide, the less susceptible you are to retaliatory attacks, right? When if I am not going to increase my tariffs no matter what, nobody else has a reason to retaliate against me. And suddenly I become a much more attractive location to have factories and production centers and so on.
I mean, the third kind of part of your kind of 3-point plan, right? In addition to tariffs, in addition to policy stability, is what we talked about earlier, which is India should move to curb, if not totally eliminate, non-tariff barriers. You talked earlier about quality control orders that essentially are acting as a kind of disguised form of protectionism rather than actually enforcing the standards that they are ostensibly set up to do. This is something also that Arvind Subramanian has recently talked about in terms of the proliferation of these quality control orders and the adverse impact that they're having on the broader trade environment. Are there other types of non-tariff barriers in addition to these kind of quality control orders that concern you and you think have kind of gotten out of hand in the Indian case?
Are there others? Nothing that comes to mind that quickly. Definitely nothing at this order of magnitude.
So this has really become like a major sticking point when it comes to the question of imports and trade.
Yeah, and let me just clarify. I mean, because you said non-tariff barriers, so we have complicated our tariff structure by having all these different types of cesses. So now we have agricultural cesses, which are applied to some sectors and not others, and there are like all different types of cesses, and it's very hard to figure out if I just look at the tariff schedule. It's only when you go to the WTO who combine all these things that you get like the 65 unique tariff categories. So there all the complication is coming on the ad valorem tariff part and not necessarily non-tariff barriers.
Just to say a word on agriculture again, because you've done so much work on this, in the piece, and you said it again today, the main exception to this broader liberalization agenda may have to be agriculture, particularly food crops. And I want to hear your logic for that. But I guess my question is, isn't this precisely the area where countries like the U.S. are going to want to push, right? I mean, for ages, the EU, the United States have been lamenting the market access barriers their own agricultural products face in India. So I guess it's kind of a two-part question. Number one, why should agriculture be treated slightly differently? And number two, is it going to be difficult to uphold those protections given the pressures that India is likely to face from the U.S. and others?
So to answer the first part, let me reiterate why the China shock, or one of the reasons why the China shock is such a special shock. And a lot has been written about the China shock, right? The reason why it is special for the Western world and the US is because everything happened very, very quickly. And I think there was a great kind of New York Times piece on this. Manufacturing sector in the West and in the US was already declining, as happens with development. We all understand this. What the China shock did, or one of the big things China shock did, was it made the transition very quick. So quick that the labor markets didn't have time to adjust. So if I was an auto worker, it's quite plausible that my children wouldn't have worked in the auto industry anyway. They would have gone to services and so on. But if I lost my job in the 40s and the 50s, there wasn't enough time and I was already too old to retool and find employment elsewhere. And that is what kind of created the political complexity. The other part which the rapid change did was that it, by decimating manufacturing from the Western world, it concentrated everything in China and it left the Western world vulnerable. Meaning, if all the key manufacturing is located in one country, then by cutting off trade, you are now very susceptible to security threats and so on. These kind of problems, if it happens too quickly, becomes all the more complex and threatening in agriculture, right? So all the parts that I just said are true about agriculture in India. A lot of people depend for their livelihoods on the agriculture sector. Agriculture is key, or the food crops are key in maintaining India's food security. And the Ukraine episode was just one episode, kind of again showing what can happen if the global trading system collapses. And so there is a good argument to be made that India should have the capacity to produce a variety of different food crops, just from the point of view of food security, if things go bad, like as an insurance, because the trading system now does not insure you against it. So back in, I think, 2014 or 15, Arvind Subramanian wrote like a report on doing an MSP or a minimum support price for pulses, which is when India had the shortage of pulses. And one of the arguments in that report was maybe you could also depend on trade partners for getting pulses if you have a shortage. If the global trading system collapses, and especially if people want to isolate you, those kind of insurance mechanisms may not be as readily available as it was like 10 years ago. And therefore, we have to kind of make an exception. But even here, I wanted to be careful and say that this is just about food crops. For non-food crops, I think all the logic that I gave with the manufacturing sector, we should still liberalize, especially because it helps another sector which is key for India's low-skill, labor-intensive manufacturing, which is food processing. So India is a very big producer of commodities, but we don't have a big market share in exports of processed food. So think tomato paste, groundnut butter, so on and so forth. We have had a little bit of success in shrimps. We have had some success recently in French fries, but it's not across the board. And that's a sector that I think can really emerge in India because of our advantage as a large producer of these of the raw products, which would be the inputs, and then kind of processing and exporting it. The other piece that makes agriculture complicated, of course, is domestic politics. I think there would be no political party that would be willing to bite the bullet and have laissez-faire in this. And so that's why I would want to make an exception for agriculture, but there again, not for food crops, not for things like bioethanol that you can import and benefit from and so on. And the third point I want to make here is climate change. Which again is a force for an open market rather than a closed market. Climate change is going to leave countries vulnerable, but at different times, right? So in some years, India might be hit, in another year, Australia might be hit, and so on. One way for all of us to ensure against these shocks is to keep trading. And there again, we should not have a narrow outlook. So India is kind of notoriously known for putting these export bans. So whenever there is domestic inflation, you would put an export ban on a product to contain that inflation and so on. But think from Bangladesh's perspective. If they are not getting potatoes but depend on India to get their supply of potatoes, and if we hit them with an export ban, then prices there rise. Over time, they are going to move away from India and look for a more stable supplier. That's not good, both from a national kind of security perspective, and that's not good for us, because tomorrow we might have to import something from them, and just being everybody's stable trade partner again gives us the leverage to depend on them when we want to import something during our times of crises.
My guest on the show this week is the economist Shoumitro Chatterjee. He is an assistant professor of international economics at Johns Hopkins-SAIS in Washington, D.C. His research lies at the intersection of development economics, trade, and macro. He's also a specialist on Indian agriculture. He is also the author of a new opinion piece in the Indian Express called "In Trump's Tariff World, India Must Say We Are Open for Business." Shoumitro, this is an incredibly complicated and kind of nuanced set of topics. I feel really delighted that you took the time to help walk us through this complicated space. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Grantamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grantamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grantamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.